I'm 23 now, but when I was 16, I lost my mom to cancer. It was brutal watching her fade away day by day, while my dad put on a brave face and told everyone he was holding up fine. We had family around, uncles, aunts, cousins, but the one person who seemed to be everywhere was my mom's younger sister, Nina. She looked so much like mom, but there was a different energy about her. She was all smiles, always hovering near dad, and I assumed it was because they both missed mom so desperately. I wanted to be grateful for the support, but there was something off, something I couldn't place at the time. It was like she had a constant need to be near him, as though she were stepping into mom's shoes before the dust had even settled. My grief overshadowed my suspicions for a while, but a few months after the funeral, I noticed how dad's entire demeanor changed whenever Nina came over. She would laugh too loudly, he would try to hush her, they'd exchange these weird glances. My gut told me something was up, but I was still a kid, and I didn't want to believe I'd lost my mother only to have her replaced so quickly. I tried talking to dad about it. I approached him one afternoon, carefully phrasing my questions so I wouldn't sound accusatory. I asked if he had feelings for Nina, or if they were just leaning on each other in their grief. He denied everything, said it was purely familial support, and that I was imagining things. I wanted to believe him, so I let it go, even though my gut churned every time I saw them whispering together in the kitchen. By the time I turned 17, their relationship seemed blatantly obvious to everyone else. My paternal grandparents started giving dad these disapproving looks, and my maternal grandparents wanted nothing to do with Nina. Still, nobody came right out and said anything. I guess we were all waiting for dad to come to his senses. One night, I came home early from a friend's place and found them on the couch, kissing. They froze when they saw me, but nobody apologized. Dad just told me to go to my room. I remember standing there in shock, my heart pounding, as Nina scrambled to fix her shirt. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. From that moment, everything changed. Dad sat me down the next day and said he was tired of hiding. He told me he and Nina had grown close after mom passed, and that love doesn't always follow polite timelines. I remember feeling sick, like I'd been punched in the stomach. He asked me to understand and accept their relationship. I told him it was wrong, that mom hadn't even been gone a full year when they'd started whatever this was. He called me disrespectful, said I didn't understand adult feelings. When I cried and told him I missed mom, he said I was overreacting, that life moves on. I snapped and called him a traitor, accused Nina of being a homewrecker. He threatened to kick me out if I kept talking like that. I thought he was bluffing, but after Nina moved in, everything became a battle. She changed the decor, got rid of mom's things, and acted like she was queen of the house. Every time I protested, dad backed her up. It was bizarre how quickly he embraced her authority. I felt like an intruder in my own home, so one day, I packed a bag and said I was going to stay with my friend Nick for a while. Dad didn't stop me. He just shrugged, said maybe some distance would do us good. I was devastated. I couldn't believe he was letting me walk out without a fight. Nick's family, luckily, was incredibly supportive. They let me crash in their guest room while I sorted out my feelings. During those weeks, I tried to keep up with school, tried to pretend my life wasn't unraveling, but everything was different. My phone rang constantly with relatives asking what was going on. My maternal grandparents were furious at dad, and my paternal grandparents were disappointed but unsure how to intervene. Nina was still around, living in my house, sleeping in my mom's bed. I couldn't get that image out of my head. It felt like a betrayal of the worst kind. And then, dad decided to make the distance permanent. He called me one evening, said that if I couldn't be respectful of his relationship, I shouldn't bother coming back. That night, I cried until I couldn't breathe. I had lost my mom, and now, effectively, I'd lost my dad. I was 17, homeless by my own father's decree. My world felt like it had collapsed, and all because I refused to play along. My grandparents on mom's side took me in eventually. They were livid at dad for throwing me out, livid at Nina for betraying her sister's memory. I stayed in their small guest bedroom, trying to piece my life back together. They helped me get counseling, supported my decision to focus on school and block dad's number if it helped me heal. Over time, I adjusted. I graduated high school, enrolled in a local college, and got a part-time job. Every time I thought about dad, I'd feel a pang of anger and hurt, but I forced myself to keep moving forward. My grandparents refused to attend any gatherings where Dad and Nina were present, and so did the rest of the maternal side. The paternal side didn't completely cut him off, but they rarely invited him to anything because it caused tension. Dad and Nina isolated themselves and seemed perfectly fine living in that bubble. Occasionally, I'd hear rumors that they'd had a small ceremony to celebrate their union. I wasn't invited. Not that I would have gone. The entire thing still felt like a twisted nightmare, but I'd moved on as best as I could, or so I thought. Then, out of the blue, I heard they had a baby. I was 20 by then, juggling college classes and working at a local bakery. The news came from a cousin on Dad's side who called to tell me that Nina had given birth to a little girl. My first reaction wasn't joy or excitement, it was numbness. I couldn't picture Dad holding another child when he'd tossed his own away. I tried not to dwell on it, but a few months later, I got a voicemail from Nina. She sounded awkward, like she was forcing a friendly tone. She said they wanted me to meet the baby and hoped we could start fresh. I never responded. Whatever fresh start they wanted, I wasn't interested. I'd built a life without them, and it was going just fine. But the phone calls didn't stop. Dad tried calling from unknown numbers. I kept blocking them. Eventually, I changed my phone number. I thought that was the end of it. For another year or so, they stayed quiet, likely busy with the baby. I moved on, focusing on my studies, dating occasionally, and finding my own sense of stability. But apparently, they hadn't given up. One afternoon, I stepped out of class and found a text from an unknown number. It was Dad. He said he and Nina needed to talk to me urgently. I ignored it. The next day, Nina messaged me on social media saying they were in a tough spot and really needed family. She claimed they were being ostracized by everyone, that they had no support, and that I was their last hope. The audacity was staggering. They had created this situation all by themselves. Dad chose to prioritize his relationship with my aunt over his relationship with me. Nina chose to sleep with her dead sister's husband. Now they wanted my sympathy? I blocked them again, hoping they'd get the message. But they began to bombard my grandparents, leaving voicemails about how they'd made mistakes and wanted to make amends. My grandparents refused to engage, but I started to get a clearer picture. Dad and Nina were facing serious financial problems. Rumor had it they'd borrowed money from some shady lenders after Dad got laid off. They must have burned bridges everywhere else. I won't lie, I felt a vicious little spark of satisfaction. Karma, I thought. This is what happens when you betray your family. Still, a part of me wondered if I was becoming as cold as they'd been. I remembered the night Dad kicked me out, how broken I'd felt. Was I really going to leave them twisting in the wind? My grandparents, however, reminded me that these were the same people who threw me away. They told me not to let guilt cloud my judgment. Dad and Nina didn't even apologize when I confronted them years ago. They just demanded obedience. And now that they were suffering, they expected me to rush in with open arms? It was absurd. Yet, I couldn't stop thinking about the baby girl, my half-sister and cousin all in one. She was innocent in all of this, and I felt a pang of sadness for her. But sadness didn't mean I was willing to bail them out. My grandparents offered a compromise. They'd talk to me about setting up a small trust for the child if Dad and Nina showed genuine remorse, not just desperation. But I'd have final say, since it was my inheritance. That gave me an idea. If Dad and Nina really wanted my help, they'd have to come clean about everything they'd done, publicly, and they'd have to do more than just say sorry. I reached out through an email sent to Nina's old address. I knew she'd check it eventually. I told them I was willing to meet in a neutral location, my grandparents' attorney's office. No promises, just a conversation. They jumped at the chance. A week later, I walked into the small conference room with my grandparents at my side, and there they were, Dad and Nina, looking haggard. Nina clutched a folder of documents, and Dad wouldn't meet my eyes at first. The attorney sat us down. Dad started talking, stumbling over his words. He tried to apologize, but quickly shifted into whining about their dire financial situation. I listened in silence, letting him dig himself deeper. Nina chimed in, saying they realized they'd made some mistakes and hoped I'd see that they've changed. I told them I was there for one reason, to see if they'd make a full confession of what they did to me, to the family, without making excuses. If they did, I'd consider establishing a trust for the baby. But there were conditions. First, they had to apologize in writing, detailing how they'd betrayed mom's memory and kicked me out. Second, they'd have to sign an agreement that they wouldn't bother me for more money beyond the trust. Third, they'd have to host a family gathering where they'd formally apologize to everyone. They looked stunned. Dad opened his mouth to protest, but Nina grabbed his arm. She tried to negotiate, suggesting that a private apology might be enough. I shook my head. I reminded them that they had privately hurt me, publicly disgraced mom's memory, and alienated the entire family. A private apology wouldn't cut it. If they wanted me to set up something for the baby, they'd have to swallow their pride. The attorney cleared his throat and explained that these were legal conditions for the trust. They could accept or walk away. I saw the anger in Dad's eyes, but they clearly needed money. After a pause, Nina nodded, and Dad finally croaked out that they'd do whatever it took. I won't lie, my hands were shaking under the table. A part of me felt guilty for orchestrating such a humiliating scenario, but another part remembered the pain of being discarded and left to fend for myself. This was the price they had to pay if they wanted help. And it wasn't just about humiliating them, it was about them taking real accountability. If they were going to raise that little girl, they needed to understand the consequences of their actions. That was my logic anyway. The written apology arrived a week later. It was full of excuses and half-hearted acknowledgments of wrongdoing. I sent it back with notes in the margins, highlighting phrases like, "We regret any hurt caused" and "unfortunate circumstances," and telling them to rewrite it in plain language that took real ownership. The second draft was better. Dad admitted he had disrespected mom's memory. Nina confessed she had crossed a moral boundary. They both acknowledged kicking me out was cruel. My grandparents and I reviewed it, and then we scheduled the family gathering. It was held at a local community center, mostly because nobody wanted Dad and Nina in their homes. I'd invited every relative who distanced themselves from Dad. Some refused to come, still too disgusted to even look at them, but a surprising number showed up. People were curious, maybe even wanting closure. When Dad and Nina entered, you could feel the tension in the air. They stood at the front of the room, me beside the attorney, and read their apology. Dad's voice shook. Nina was on the verge of tears. They admitted everything, starting a relationship shortly after Mom died, treating me like an obstacle, shutting me out of my own home. They apologized to the family for the shame they'd brought. Watching them stand there, humbled and shaky, felt surreal. I'd spent years imagining scenarios of revenge, but now that it was happening, I just felt a strange calm. After the apology, the attorney explained the conditions of the trust. I had set aside a modest amount that would be strictly for the baby's education and basic needs, administered by a trustee, not by Dad or Nina. They couldn't access it for themselves, only for documented expenses related to the child. And if they violated any part of the agreement, the funds would be frozen. Dad and Nina looked like they'd swallowed broken glass, but they nodded. Some relatives actually seemed to soften, especially when they realized the money was purely for the child's benefit. I stood up and said a few words about how I'd been treated, how I'd survived, and how this trust was in no way a reconciliation. It was just a measure to ensure an innocent child wouldn't suffer for her parents' actions. Then I left. I didn't stay to chat or accept any apologies beyond what was already stated. I walked out of that community center feeling lighter. I'd gotten the closure I needed and set boundaries so they'd never come crawling for more. That was enough for me. In the weeks that followed, I heard from a few relatives that Dad and Nina tried to spin the event as a big misunderstanding, but nobody was really buying it. I didn't bother correcting them. I'd done my part. They had publicly apologized, signed legal documents, and accepted the trust arrangement for the baby's sake. If they wanted to cling to their pride, that was their issue. My grandparents expressed some relief that I'd found a way to handle it without resorting to outright cutting off the child. Deep down, I hoped my half-sister cousin would grow up with at least some financial stability despite her parents' mistakes. And I felt no urge to reconcile with Dad. Every so often, I'd think about the day he threatened to kick me out, how easily he let me go. That wound was still there. It might always be. But I'd done what I needed to do. I had my own life to live, my own goals to chase. I'd graduate soon, hopefully move into a better apartment, and maybe one day start a family of my own. Dad's choices had forced me to grow up fast, but I'd come out stronger. And I'd never forgive him. I didn't need to. Sometimes people ask me if I've truly moved on, or if there's a part of me that craves more retribution. Honestly, I think I've had all the revenge I need. Forcing Dad and Nina to own up to their betrayal in front of the entire family was cathartic, and ensuring any financial help goes solely to the child was the best solution I could find. I'm not interested in trying to destroy their lives. They've done enough damage on their own. From what I hear, their marriage is strained and they struggle to maintain friendships. That's punishment enough. Besides, I'm busy living my life. I've got a decent job lined up after graduation and a circle of friends who feel more like family than Dad ever did. I have my grandparents to thank for standing by me, and I'm determined to make them proud. These days, my focus is on building a future that's free of their toxicity. I haven't seen Dad or Nina in person since that apology event, and I don't plan to. Sometimes I wonder if they truly grasp the magnitude of what they did, or if they still tell themselves a story that paints me as the ungrateful child. But it doesn't matter. I reclaimed my dignity by refusing to let them trample on my feelings anymore. Maybe in the distant future, my half-sister will seek me out, and I'll tell her the truth. Not to poison her against her parents, but so she understands where I stand. I won't lie. I'm still angry sometimes, but that anger reminds me I'm alive, that I survived, and I'll make sure Dad and Nina never forget the cost of their betrayal. They made their choice. I made mine. That's the end of my story.